This bull isn't nearly as long as it is on this slide. I want to thank the organizers for having me here and hosting me in Uruguay yet again. It's a great privilege to be able to share with you some of the work that I've done about economic indexes throughout the Americas. As breeders, you give people about 2 minutes at your sale to tell you which one of these bulls is better. I ask you, given those EPD profiles, which one of these bulls is better? Time's up. We've taken your money. Thank you very much. The reality is, on the American Hereford Index for CHB, they have the same economic value. On the Baldy Maternal Index, they are quite different, and the top bull is superior. But how many people, without the use of the index, would arrive at that conclusion? I submit to you, not very many. But I also want to submit to you, as breeders, you all use indexes unknowingly, if not knowingly. If we took the last 50 bulls that you have bought to use in your herd and took their EPD profiles and presented them to a reasonably intelligent graduate student, we could use a technology called index in retrospect to discern exactly what the economic weights that you applied to the traits were. We do that looking backward. What I'm talking about today is doing the same process looking forward. I'm going to talk about 5 different exercises, one involving the Canadian Hereford Association work that I did, some work that I'm doing with Fernando Cardoso in Brazil, some work with the American Hereford Association, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that was done by a student with Dorian Garrick here in Uruguay, or with relevance here in Uruguay, that was published in Livestock Science, independent of my own work. For the American Hereford Association, I can go back. Let me back up. This all revolves around some systems analysis work, some modeling work, if you will, where we generate a computer model, an abstraction of commercial production that is driven both by biological variables and economic variables, with one of the primary outcomes of that model being profitability, or how much money you make, the difference between income and expense. Any model is an abstraction from the actual system. It's a condensed version. It does not capture every possible fine detail. We use it as a way to integrate data from a variety of places, data that we capture based on the information you submit to evaluation services, data that's captured in experiments conducted by researchers in various places. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is capture the primary sources of income and expense attributable to beef production. The economic data that I've used historically has been to look backward in time for a period of, say, 20 years, where I have annually costs and sources of income over a 20-year time horizon, and detrended those for inflation to bring them to current. And then I've tried as best I can to look into the future and say, is the past reflective of the future? And in fact, more often than not, it is indeed borne out that the past is a pretty good indicator of what the future economic conditions will be. Maybe not at the absolute level, but at the level of relative income, sources of income, beef price and corn price or grass rents. Those tend to change in a fair degree of synchrony with each other. We might look at the times when income and expense are incurred or received, and we might discount those to bring them to a constant point in time. But in all of this effort, we drive the models with data, with real numbers, with real data. It's not something that we dream up. Question that often gets asked, because most of you would tell me if I ask you privately that your operation is special, your operation is unique. So one objective or many? The two maps here are designed to remind me that I did an exercise with Angus cattle where I compared breeding objectives for the U.S. and for South Africa for a World Angus conference such as this one. And those production systems are very different. In the U.S., we start to accept carcasses at somewhere 250 kilos or perhaps a little more as the lower end of acceptable. In South Africa, that's the upper end of acceptable, and they discount any carcass that's heavier. So the production systems, at least as typified by carcass weight, are very, very different. Obviously, vast potential for genotype by environment interaction between the two countries, and so on. So the breeding objectives for the two countries have more or less maximal opportunity to be different. And yet, if we look at the genetic correlation between those objectives, that genetic correlation is 0.68. Quite high. I would submit to you that if you have producer A and producer B located within 300 kilometers of each other, their opportunity for that correlation to be much higher is substantial. I do indexing with a mental model that I'll take just a minute to explain. It's been gone through in many ways this morning already by many of the previous speakers. We have genetic values for however many traits that are in the model. And we've talked about the pedigree and phenotype-based EBV that's traditional. And we've talked about a genomic EBV that's more contemporary in its development. And we've put those together in one way or another to produce an EPD or an EBV for each trait. There's a series of however many traits, N traits. And what I want to talk about now is the process of blending those traits together into a single measure of a breeding goal, which you might call an EPD or EBV for profitability. This is as much math as I'm going to put on a slide. It might be too much. But basically, the breeding goal, which we might abbreviate by H, and if I'd realized the previous speaker was going to use H as abbreviation for a relationship matrix, I'd have picked something else. But H here is the breeding goal, and it is given as the sum of economic weights for individual traits times the true breeding values for those individual traits. But as Dr. Henderson showed us some years ago, this is really equivalent to the sum of the economic weights times the EBVs for those traits. This is very convenient from my standpoint because I don't have to worry about all the math that they go through to estimate the EBVs or EPDs. I simply have to worry about the little bit of math that I do to estimate the economic weights. I'm going to submit that economic merit is income minus expense. Income is based on several traits. Expense is based on several traits. They don't have to be the same traits. They can be different traits. And in fact, they are different traits. And what I want to do is I want to estimate economic weights as the change in profit that results from a change of one trait holding all other traits constant. That concept is different than the way we typically want to think. Because many of the traits that we evaluate, winning weight and yearling weight, have a part-whole relationship one to the other. I want to talk about the change in winning weight with carcass weight, for instance, held constant. And I want to talk about the change in carcass weight with winning weight held constant. Those are the relevant things for economic weights. Oops, wrong button. So there's some commonalities in the models that have been done that are associated with all of the work that I've done, and most of the work that was done for Uruguay. We look at age-specific rates of reproduction and disappearance that result in an equilibrium age distribution. It's not necessarily the age distribution that's present on your farm at any one point in time, but if you had 100 years of sample from your farm, it's that age distribution that would be present in the long term. I use random elements or stochastic elements to facilitate price discrimination for outputs. In the US, that price discrimination is carcass weight, marbling, and yield grade. In other places, that might be carcass weight and age, teeth, if you will, and fat cover. And I look at expense both arising from feed and per diem costs. So I separate those. I am a fan of what might be called a full cycle perspective. I want to take it from conception to consumption. I'm not a fan of breaking it up into parts. Those are, in my opinion, breaking it up into parts is how can I do a disservice either to my customers? How can I be disrespectful of the interests of my customers? If I, as a cow-calf producer, produce an animal that doesn't work in the feedlot or doesn't work for the packing plant, the slaughterhouse, then I'm really not servicing an entire industry. And I think breeding decisions should be focused on an entire industry. My preference is to embrace commercial production. These indexes should target commercial production, and in partial reflection of that, I am in favor of embracing crossbreeding, whether it's Hereford with Nelore in Brazil or it's Hereford with Angus in the US, those kinds of things. That's not to say that I've always been successful in convincing a client to do this, but this is what I would favor. And I model reproduction to reflect successful reproduction over a series of production cycles. Income is derived from cull cows based on their carcass weight, and in some instances, maybe their age, and harvested progeny based on some premium and discounts received for better and worse carcasses. I'm going to go through, if you will, some features of each of the several indexes I'm going to talk about. For the Canadian Hereford Association, they have two indexes based on straight-bred Hereford. The Maternal Productivity Index, MPI, and a Feedlot Merit Index, FMI. These are the sort of adjacent segments of the production system. The MPI, the calves are sold at weaning with a price slide based on weight. So lighter weight calves bring more money per kilo than heavier calves, and premiums and discounts based on their expected future performance as assessed by the Feedlot Merit Index. So reputation feeder calves bring a slightly higher price at weaning than do nondescript feeder calves. The additional income from cull cows is based on weight, and stayability is derived from that equilibrium age distribution. The Feedlot Merit Index essentially picks up where the MPI leaves off. Income is derived from the harvested progeny, with carcass weight as the main source of income, discounts and premiums based on USDA quality and yield grade grids. All of the expenses are those attributable to the feedlot, and the economic value for average daily gain is altered to reflect expected feed intake. So there's no direct consideration of a feed intake EPD. The Brazilian effort, I'd love to have results. I'm not quite quick enough on the computer, having just last week done some of this work, is a full cycle perspective, finishing entirely based on grass, no feedlot, price discrimination based on age, weight, and fat score. And in this index, we're incorporating some of Fernando's work on susceptibility to ticks, both as a direct cost and as an opportunity cost for the animals that are lost. The Uruguayan work is independent of previously described work. It's work that was done separately. It's for purebred Hereford. Income from steers, excess heifers, and non-pregnant cows. They do include feed as a source of expense, and the difference in income minus expense, if you will, generated from each trait when changed one unit with all other traits held constant, served as a basis for the economic values. Somewhere I lost the American slide. But the American slide is very similar, as you might guess. This is the only result that I'm going to show you, the only numerical result that I'm going to show you. This has 5 separate indexes in it. The red bars are the Uruguayan index, the Baldy maternal index, and the CHB index from the US, the maternal productivity index, and the feedlot merit index from Canada. A couple of things that really stuck out to me when I looked at this. The Uruguayan index and the Baldy maternal index. Very similar emphasis for growth, very similar emphasis for feed intake. The Uruguayan index did not have carcass price discrimination in it, so there's no carcass bar here. Carcass weight itself I've called a growth trait. But those two indexes are very, very similar to each other. I would submit you could use the Uruguayan index to evaluate cattle in the U.S., or conversely, you could use the U.S. index to evaluate cattle in Uruguay, and you'd end up in very much the same place. Fitness traits don't enter into the CHB index at a very low level. Only calving difficulty, direct, and it's a very small contributor. You can't hardly see it. The Canadian MPI index, fitness traits, reproduction, calving difficulty, are much more important, and a large part of that results because the slide, the differential pricing of lightweight calves versus heavyweight calves at weaning diminishes the value of growth from birth to weaning. And you see that as this bar, this yellow bar, being substantially lower than the others. And again, in Feedlot Merit Index in Canada, the fitness traits are a fairly small contributor relative to the others. Growth traits, actually, with the exception of the Feedlot Merit Index, the growth traits are somewhat similar emphasis across all the indexes. Feed intake, where it's used directly, somewhat similar emphasis, more in CHB because CHB has fewer traits in it, and therefore individual traits have opportunity to make greater contribution. Carcass merit, greatest in the CHB index, and then the Feedlot Merit Index in Canada, slightly less. This is interesting to me because of the similarities. I wouldn't make quite so much of the differences. I want to show you the genetic trend in the indexes, and these are taken from the American Hereford Association website. The red bars indicate the CHB index. The blue bars indicate the Baldy maternal index. So this index has fewer traits in it, and those traits share, for the most part, very positive, strong correlations. So it's easier to move this index up than it is to move this index up in terms of economic value. But since the adoption of indexes by the American Hereford Association in 1990, the trends for those indexes has been favorable over time and more or less linear. In summary, I think indexes are extremely valuable. They put the focus of genetic improvement programs on economics rather than on traits. And I believe it was Dorian Garrick who said at one point, if your focus of your beef production enterprise is not on economics, then I wish you good luck with your hobby. Most commercial producers, I believe, are in the business to make money. And as seed stock producers, I believe we have an obligation to help them make money. I think the other thing that I would take home is the considerable similarity across countries and across production systems of many of these indexes. With that, I share with you the picture of the bovine genome sequence cow. From a scientific perspective, perhaps the most influential Hereford cow in the world. Thank you very much for your attention.